Chapter 4. Two Bullies. As Pete crashed through the ice, Pam and Ricky screamed. They did not know how deep the stream was and feared their brother would go in over his head. The cold water took Pete's breath away. Fortunately, when his feet touched the bottom of the stream, he was standing only chest high in the water. "Don't worry," he called to his sister and brother. "I can get out of this easily." Pete rested his elbows on the ice and tried to wiggle up out of the hole. But the ice around him kept cracking off. Twice he nearly made it, but slipped back again each time. By this time he was numb from the cold and his teeth were chattering. "We'll help you," Pam offered, becoming worried. A moment later, Mr. Hollister appeared. He had heard the children scream. "Oh, Dad, help us get Pete," Pam begged. Their father ran to the edge of the brook. He lay down on his stomach and inched his way toward Pete. Finally, their hands touched. "Grab on and hold tight," Mr. Hollister directed Pete, then said to the other children, "Hold my feet in case the ice cracks under me." Ricky held on to one of Mr. Hollister's shoes while Pam grasped the other. They tugged frantically and slowly pulled their father backwards. He, in turn, pulled Pete from the icy water, inch by inch. Finally, the boy, too, lay flat on the ice and was drawn to the shore. Pete shivered as he rose to his feet. "Wow, I'm cold." Mr. Hollister said there was not a second to lose. "You must get to Mr. Quist's house at once. Try to run all the way, Pete, before the water freezes on you." They all set off at a brisk pace. I guess I'm all right. My toes were numb for a while, but I can feel them again," Pete panted as they neared the small farmhouse. Mrs. Hollister, followed by Holly and Sue, hurried toward the dripping boy. They were quickly told the story and went with Pete into the house. The front door swung open, and Mrs. Quist said, "Oh dear, what happened?" Upon hearing of the accident, she said, "You poor boy, hurry in." She led Pete into her warm kitchen and gave him a chair alongside a wood stove. Quickly, she and Mrs. Hollister bent down to remove Pete's boots and mittens. Then they massaged his feet and hands until warmth came back into them. Presently, Mr. Quist came in. Hearing what had happened, he said to his wife, "Ebba, I'll take this boy upstairs for a change of clothes." Pete, his trousers clinging to his skin, followed the man up a narrow stairway. A few minutes later, the boy reappeared, wearing a red and white bathrobe that reached to his ankles and was much too large. Mrs. Quist laughed. "You look like our Christmas Jewel Nisha coming out of the attic," she said. "Jewel Nisha? What's that?" Holly asked. "Oh, he belongs to all the Scandinavian countries," Mrs. Quist explained. "Papa and I are Danes. Although we have been in the United States a long time, we still remember Christmas as it was back in Denmark." "Please tell us about Jewel Nisha," Pam begged. Mrs. Quist brushed back a wisp of blonde hair from her forehead and waited until her husband had hung Pete's clothes back of the stove to dry. Then she said, "The Jewel Nisha is as mysterious as Santa Claus is. We know about him, but we never see him." The children listened eagerly while the kind Danish woman told them that the Jewel Nisha was a very sweet little old man who lived in one's attic. He was seen by nobody but the family cat. "Whenever strange things happen in the house," Mrs. Quist said, shaking her finger, "we believe the Jewel Nisha has done it. But he's a good fellow. He makes sure that the animals on the farm are taken care of." Mr. Quist nodded. "The Jewel Nisha sees to it that they're always watered, tended, and bedded." His wife went on with her story. "Every Christmas Eve," she said, "the children in Denmark put a bowl of porridge and a pitcher of milk at the entrance to their attics. And next morning, guess what?" "It's gone," Ricky said. Yes, it always is, Mrs. Quist replied, laughing. The Jewel Nisha eats it? Holly asked. When Mrs. Quist nodded, Sue hopped over and sat in her lap. Does the Jewel Nisha have a mother? The little girl asked. I never heard of one. Then who feeds Mr. Jewel Nisha the rest of the year? Sue asked, perplexed. He must get awful hungry. The woman shrugged. And you children must be hungry too, Mrs. Quist said, without answering Sue's question. Especially you, Pete. Are you getting warm? The boy had stopped shivering. He admitted that he was hungry. She hurried into the pantry for milk and chocolate. In a few minutes, the delightful aroma of steaming chocolate filled the kitchen. Everybody had a cupful. Then Mr. Quist passed around a plateful of crisp Danish cookies. Yummy, these are good, Ricky said, taking a drink of chocolate. By the time the Hollisters had finished eating, Pete's clothes were dry. He went upstairs to put them on, returning in a few minutes. The Hollisters bundled themselves into their warm coats and thanked their kind hosts. When you come back for your tree, Mrs. Quist said, stop in and see me. Thank you, we'd like to, Mrs. Hollister replied. Goodbye, Sue said, waving. I'm going home and look for the Jewel Nisha in our attic. The Hollisters sang Christmas carols all the way home. Holly, holding the bird's nest in her lap so as not to crush it, added a song about wintertime birds. She could hardly wait for the next day to come so she could carry the nest to school. After breakfast next morning, Mr. Hollister said to her, I think you better put it in a bag, dear. Oh, Mommy, I want to show the nest to all my friends on the way to school, Holly pleaded. May I, please? All right, but be sure not to drop it, her mother said. Birds' nests are very fragile. The four children left for school together. Sue was not yet old enough to go, but she constantly talked about kindergarten and played school at home. Holly and Pam hurried ahead, while Pete and Ricky stopped at their garage to put some grain into Bingo's box. He looks kind of lonesome, Ricky remarked. He patted the burro and said, I'll play with you after school. Meanwhile, Holly and Pam were far ahead. Suddenly, Holly looked up at her sister and said, Do you suppose the Jewel Nisha put that funny note on Domingo's ribbon? Pam smiled. Why do you think so? She asked. Because the verse was signed Y-I-F, and Jewel Nisha begins with a Y, doesn't it, Pam? No, honey, with a J. Oh dear, said Holly. When are we ever going to find out? Pam was assuring her sister that they would sometime, when Joey Brill and Will Wilson ran up to the two girls. Hey, what you got there? Will asked, seeing the bird's nest. Trying to be a teacher's pet, taking something to her, huh? Joey sneered. The girls did not answer. Joey and Will edged closer. Want a better look, Will? Joey said, winking at his friend. As if by accident, Will hit the underside of Holly's arm, and the bird's nest flew backward into the air. Stop that! Came a voice behind them as Ricky ran up. He was just in time to catch the nest before it hit the ground. He handed the nest back to Holly. Oh, a good catcher, eh? Joey taunted Ricky. Then he added, Say, Will, suppose you and I play ball with the nest. You can't have it, Holly cried, pulling away from him. As he reached toward the girl, Pam pushed the bully. Joey shoved her back. Quit it, Ricky cried out, thumping Joey on the chest. Don't get wise, Joey shouted, pushing Ricky toward Will Wilson. Will gave the little boy another shove, and Ricky fell to the ground. Just then there came the sound of running feet. Joey turned around and shouted, "Hey, Will, look out!" But the warning came too late. Pete Hollister made a flying leap at Will, knocked him flat on the ground, and fell on top of him. Ricky jumped around excitedly. "Serves you right, Joey, for pretending you were the Board of Health and saying we couldn't keep our burro." "That was only for fun," Joey cried before he realized he was making a confession. Will struggled to his feet, and for a few moments he and Joey both punched at Pete, who finally landed a direct hit on Joey's cheek. Suddenly a siren sounded and a car pulled up to the curb. "Run, it's a cop!" one of the onlookers shouted. But before anyone had a chance to break away, a handsome young policeman stepped from the car and hurried over to the boys. "Officer Cal," Pam said. The Holsters knew Cal Newberry because they had helped him solve a mystery shortly after their arrival in Shoreham. "Why can't you fellas play together peacefully?" the policeman asked. "Okay, we will," Will said, looking very pouty. "Now, all three of you shake hands," the officer continued. The boys did this without much enthusiasm, and Cal watched them as they made their way into the schoolyard before driving off. "We were lucky," said Holly, as she left the others and hurried to her classroom. "Joey might have ruined my prize." Her teacher, Miss Tucker, was delighted with the bird's nest and said it had been made by a wren. All the children looked at it as they told the story of the Christmas tree. "And now, Holly, will you please place the nest in the nature exhibit?" Miss Tucker requested. Holly proudly placed it in the glass case at the back of the room. Then the children marched to the auditorium for assembly. Principal Russell announced that the school would have a pageant the Thursday before Christmas, depicting holiday customs in other lands. "Each class will represent a different country and will work out its own skits," he said. Holly's first grade class was assigned Switzerland. Ricky's second graders were to do Norway. Pam's fifth grade had Italy, and Pete's seventh grade room was to depict the Netherlands. Plans were begun at once, and the Hollisters hoped to be given various parts. What a busy, exciting day it was for them. And to end it, Mr. Hollister was to bring the sleigh and reindeer to be put on the roof of the trading post. The children eagerly watched for their father at supper time, but he did not come. They finally ate. Still he did not arrive. "Do you suppose something is the matter?" Pam asked her mother nervously.